Opportunity, ability, and will. Many believe the first of these to be beyond their control. The weak and ineffectual bemoan their circumstance, the cruelty of a galaxy that would not reward their entitled mediocrity. The exceptional know that opportunity must be wrought, it must be wrestled free. Opportunity must be ripped raw and bloody from the corpus empiric, and those incapable of doing so are forever doomed to lament its absence. Ability is an altogether more clean-cut matter. One either possesses ability or one does not. Strive, toil, fight tooth and nail to make more of yourself than the accident of birth has promised. It matters not. The truly gifted do not strive to attain mastery of their art, but rather to keep pace with the rapacious appetites of their own brilliance. To such beings all others are but mortal clay to be fashioned as they will. Such is their right and calling. Will is simplest of all. Will is strength when all about you preach weakness. Will is courage when your peers are cowards all. Will is the hand that reaches fearless into the fire, the eye that does not look away, the mind that comprehends that right and wrong are naught but laughable constructs made to trammel the weak. Will is taking the forbidden step, voicing the forbidden thought, opening the forbidden door. Will is doing what you must, though all about you wail that you must not. Will is power. Opportunity, ability, and will. With these three things I shall break the fetters of mortality. With these three things I shall master the secrets of life and death. With these three things I shall become a god. Fabius Bile. Extract from his mysterious Vitalis Exacto, Meditations upon the Key to the Gates of Life and Death. Games Workshop, Psychic Awakening, War of the Spider. The Emperor's realm reels in the wake of the Great Rift's opening. Everywhere madness and mutation run riot, and imperial armies fight desperate battles for survival against nightmarish odds. Chaos is in the ascendant, and in few locations is this more true than amidst the flames of war-zone Cadia. Long did the fortress world of Cadia stand against the furious assaults of Abaddon the Despoiler and his 13th Black Crusade. Yet it could not stand forever. Abaddon left Cadia a shattered and blasted husk. As he swept on towards fresh conquests, the warp interstice known as the Eye of Terror expanded in his wake. Day by day it swallows more of the region known as the Cadian Gate, and as the tendrils of the warp spread like blood through churning waters, one planetary system after another is beset by massed psychic mutation and plagues of madness. The core of Abaddon's Black Crusade forces may have accompanied their master towards Warzone Vigilus, but teeming hordes of heretics, renegades, demons, and opportunistic xenos still prey upon the isolated imperial enclaves that remain. Tides of anarchy and bloodshed sweep through Warzone Cadia, presenting to some a golden opportunity to further their own twisted agendas. Fabius Bile is one such profiteer of misery. Emerging from his stronghold deep within the Eye of Terror, the spider spins a new web of cruelty and perversion. Working through puppet warlords and experimental subjects, he has drawn in foes from both the Death Guard and the elite agents of the Imperium. He seeks to reap a nightmarish bioharvest from these assembled enemies, so as to further his latest malign schemes. Yet they are dangerous quarries indeed. Bile's forces are outnumbered, and he will require all of his wicked cunning if he is to emerge victorious from this war he has begun. A convergence of prey. Fabius Bile's campaign against the forces of the Death Guard and the Imperium took place amidst the war-torn ruins of the Cadian Gate. Its seeds were sown elsewhere, however, some in the benighted Scourge Stars, and others upon the bloody soil of the world of Cassidor. Cassidor had long been the chapter planet of the Brazen Drakes, noble and selfless defenders of humanity, the Brazen Drakes had fought in the Emperor's name for over 5,000 years. Amidst the darkness of the Noctis Aeterna, however, everything changed. Some believed that their chapter master, Argento Corian, had been concealing latent psychic abilities for years. Others claimed that they manifested as a result of the Great Rift's baleful influence. Whatever the truth, by the time the Noctis Aeterna had ended, Corian and over half his chapter had turned renegade. Accounts of the brutal civil war that followed could fill a volume of their own. How Corian renamed himself the Enlightener of his faithful disciples, how their conflict with their loyalist former brethren spiraled out to consume 3 entire Imperial systems, how at last the Brazen Drakes were defeated by the Torchbearer task force charged with delivering Primaris gene tech to the once loyal Space Marines. The Enlightener and the ragged remains of his warriors fled final retribution. They made for the Nachmund Gauntlet and the perception of safety offered by the lawless wilds beyond. In their wake, the Torchbearer fleet, commanded by Adeptus Custodes, Shield Captain Atal Tyvar, destroyed the gene tech they had brought with them and executed the handful of surviving Brazen Drake Grey Shields, lest the taint of their chapter's heresy run through their veins. Tyvar then vowed that he and his fleet would hunt the Enlightener to the ends of the galaxy and set off in furious pursuit. Little did they suspect that news of the Brazen Drake's perfidy had made it back to Terra by secret channels, and that another Imperial force was mobilizing elite assets to track Corian down and slay him. New schemes. Fabius Baal's path converged with that of the Enlightener by chance. Deep within the war-torn expanse of the Cadian Gate, the primogenitor was ever a master opportunist, and soon turned happenstance to his advantage. Baal was laboring in service to a grand new scheme, one he had conceived of even as the galaxy writhed with the opening of the Great Rift. Speculation was rife throughout the Eye of Terror and beyond as to what the Spider might be planning: another attempt at cloning or creating his own Primarch, the fashioning of some dread new altered army, development of a weapon that could lay low Robot Gilliman, or indeed any other similarly godlike being. Baal himself had revealed nothing of his schemes, even to his closest lieutenants, but he moved with a purpose through the mayhem and horror of the Imperium Nihilus. That purpose had first manifested in the theft of a mighty arcane artifact that had originally been bestowed upon the Death Guard by none other than the great unclean one Rotigus himself. Named the Arch Cornucontagious, this gruesome gift of Nurgle seethed with a warp malady that triggered catastrophic and uncontrolled bodily regeneration in its victims. To the unnatural physiognomies of the Death Guard, this was a boon, for the Ark's foul emissions allowed them to heal battle damage faster than their foes could inflict it. To any other being, however, the relic's effect was a monstrous blight that soon reduced even the mightiest warrior to a heaving mound of diseased flesh and ruptured blubbery innards. What uses Baal could have for such a perilous and revolting artifact was a secret he kept to himself. Regardless, at the head of a ragtag alliance of renegade warbands, he had braved the perils of the newly conquered Scourge Stars and successfully made off with the Ark, safely swathing it with a potent stasis field. That campaign had lost Baal all but a handful of his followers, however. Now he fled back towards the Eye of Terror, through the roiling warp storms of the Imperium Nihilus, with Typhus himself at his heels. Baal could not flee directly back to his lair in the Eye of Terror, lest he bring the wrath of the Death God down upon it. He needed fresh allies who could help him dissuade his pursuers before he made good his escape. Fate, or perhaps the Dark Gods, sent him the Enlightener. Argento Corian had not been idle since reaching Warzone Cadia. He had claimed the tainted fortress world of Dessar for his base, and had reforged the Brazen Drakes into a warband calling themselves the Shriven, who now fought under the colours of Abaddon's Black Legion. Yet Corian had caught wind of the vengeful Imperial pursuit even now bearing down upon him. Thus, even as Baal saw in the Shriven an army he could turn against his pursuers, so they believed that with the primogenitor's gifts they would be strong enough to crush the Imperial agents coming for their heads. It was a diabolic alliance of mutual mistrust, and one that Baal soon turned to his twisted advantage. Ambush on Limaxis. By the time Fabius Bile joined his forces to the Black Legionaries of the Shriven, Typhus and his plague fleet were close on his heels. Recognizing that swift action was crucial, Bile wasted no time convincing the Enlightener to mobilize his forces in exchange for certain gifts of augmentation. The poisonous light of a mutant star painted the brutish towers and redoubts of Dessar as Fabius Bile and Argento Corian cemented their alliance. Bile co-opted a sprawling suite of bio-warded vaults within which to continue his great works. He concealed the Arc Cornu Contagious behind runic locks and servitor guns, then set his acolytes to work augmenting an initial wave of Shriven warriors. The Enlightener, it seemed, had lost none of the strategic cunning or charisma from his days as a loyalist chaptermaster. Bile saw evidence of not only a prodigious private army of heretics Astartes serving at Corian's whims, but also hordes of cultists, mutants and rogue psychers, as well as a menacing complement of traitor warships that prowled the void beyond Dessar's orbital envelope. Bile knew he could do much with such resources, but time was of the essence. Even as he worked upon Corian's bio-augmentations in person, the Spider urged his new employer to swift action against the approaching threats. Though he was initially fixated upon his Imperial pursuers, the Enlightener soon grasped the true scale of the more immediate peril presented by Typhus's death guard. He might have been expected to fly into a rage when he realized the size of the army that pursued his new ally. He did not. The elixirs Bile had injected him with had made Corian stronger, but also plunged the hooks of addiction and dependency into his soul. Coupled with certain subtle but invasive augmentations the Spider had wrought within his nervous system, the Enlightener was now Fabius Bile's creature whether he wished it or no. Warp auguries by Corian's slave sorcerers suggested that Typhus's flagship, the dreaded Terminus Est, was but days from exiting the warp above Dessar. Worse, the omens told of a fleet of plague ships sailing in his polluted wake, all of them packed to the gunwales with the diseased worshippers of Nurgle. If Typhus's force was allowed to attack the Shriven in such strength, then the fight might well go ill for Bile and his new allies. Even if they prevailed against the Traveller, the Shriven would be decimated, left powerless to stop the Imperial forces also drawing closer by the day. A preemptive strike was required to bleed Typhus's forces so badly that their attack would stall, or be called off altogether. The Enlightener suggested the world of Limaxis, though Dessar shared its local space with a handful of gas giants and radiation-bathed hellscapes. Limaxis was the only nominally habitable planet that now lay between Typhus and his quarry. In the wake of whatever catastrophe destroyed its cities, Limaxis' oceans had risen to swallow all but one of its land masses. This region, now known only as the Drowning Wastes, had become a swampy morass from which rose the rusting cadavers of dead high cities and long-abandoned imperial fortifications. Such terrain was hardly the ideal theatre in which to face the relentless Death Guard or the corrupting plagues, but with their strategic options limited, Bile and Corian elected to proceed. Moving fast, the Enlightener mobilized almost half of his military assets. He and Bile led a formidable force into the void towards Limaxis, accompanied by the first batch of grotesquely altered Shriven, known as the Tirata, and augmented with certain arcane technologies that Bile had accumulated over his long years. Their plan was set. The Spider was determined to drive Typhus from his trail, and cared little for what this would cost his allies. Dangerous prey. Since departing the Scourged Stars upon Bile's trail, Typhus and his Vectoriums had been guided by the otherworldly senses of caged demonic predators. The vile liquid entities had followed the Spider's psychic spoor with much ill-natured hissing and bubbling, but when they suddenly went into a rabid frenzy, Typhus took note. Surely, suddenly, he was all but on top of his prey. The Terminus Est tore its way through the ectoplasmic meniscus of real space like a putrid maggot bursting from the flesh of a corpse. Wallowing plague ships followed it out, all of them quickly detecting the frantic distress calls echoing across long-range vox. It was the work of moments to confirm that the choral signifier as belonging to the Wretch, the warship aboard which Bile had made good his escape some weeks earlier. The vessel hung in low orbit over a nearby world, its warp engines dead, its blast-riddled hull bleeding atmosphere. There were life signs aboard, but they were faint. Suspecting a trap, Typhus elected not to board the crippled craft. Instead, he commanded carefully targeted salvos of lance fire that shot out the wretch's remaining engines and sunk it shuddering down into the planet's atmosphere. Let the ship crash down upon that marshy world, Typhus thought. The Ark was an artifact blessed by Nurgle himself and would come to no harm. As for Baal and whatever followers he had left, Typhus doubted they would prove as durable. It seemed as though someone survived aboard the wretch, however. The ship fired emergency atmospheric thrusters that turned its plunge into a graceless glide and saw it splash down a few miles south of a toppled high spire. The impact was enough to tear the wretch in two and leave its innards strewn across a dozen miles of swampland. Typhus did not care. He ordered his ships to settle in orbit, then led a substantial invasion force down to the surface to claim his prize, and ideally, Baal's rotting head. Rust-pocked landers and attack craft rumbled down through Limaxis' atmosphere, foul pollutants and unholy plague spores trailing behind them. One by one, the noxious vessels settled in the planet's shallow waters and spread slicks of foulness across the surface. Thrumming clouds of plague flies boiled from the landers' noisome interiors as plague marines, diseased cultists, and bloated demon engines disembarked in great number. Plague-burst crawlers threw up great fans of putrid mud as their treads churned in the filth. Led by Typhus' trusted lieutenants, the war bands waded through the mire and took up positions upon islands of comparative solid ground around the crash site. Typhus and his entourage of Blightlord Terminators entered the wreck, following flickering energy signatures to where they believed Baal must have concealed the Ark. Typhus was more than displeased when, instead of his precious relic, he found himself confronted with a rabble of half-dead slave clones and an extremely large bomb. The explosion sent rolling waves through the swamp water and blazing wreckage crashing down amidst the alarmed Death Guard. Before its echoes had even died away, the traitor Vox channels filled with gurgling cries of distress from on high. The plague ships were under attack. Slipping from behind the concealment of Baal's pilfered and retrofitted Cormorite night shields, 4 shriven warships dove into the midst of Typhus' unsuspecting plague fleet. The dark of the void lit up with flickering lance fire and the rippling fire blooms of broadside after broadside as the Black Legionaries punished their diseased enemies for their incursion. The Lamentation was destroyed entirely, its blazing wreckage filling the Limaxian skies with streaks of fire as it broke up. The Moribund, the Feculent Gift, and the Rancid Blade were all heavily damaged. Recognizing that their position was untenable, the last 3 untouched plague ships broke orbit amidst flurries of diseased ordnance and drove for clear space in the hopes of reforming and launching a determined counterattack. Dreadcore drop pods and armoured gunships streaked down from the launch bays of the shriven cruisers, bearing Baal, Corian, and their followers to war. At the same time, advanced bands of Terrata, who had landed on the planet the day before and advanced under a blanket of Sorcerer's concealment, hurled themselves at the Death Guard defences. The thump of bolters and the boom of heavy artillery echoed across the fetid marshes as Typhus' forces let fly. Altered warriors dropped, thrashing and gushing boiling ichor as their wounded bodies self-destructed. Dread claws hit their mire amidst immense plumes of dirty water, disgorging squads of Black Legionaries who hammered the Death Guard with close-range fire, then charged their positions with chainsaws howling. The Enlightener himself hovered from his transport's ramp surrounded by a furious psychic corona, drifting into the battle with beams of ravening warp energy leaping from his blazing eyes. Baal, meanwhile, shadowed his puppet warlord, his clipped orders sending in howling bands of altered warriors to drive back any plague marines who looked to be staging a breakout. The Death Guard positions recoiled and contracted like wounded mollusks. Plague cultists died in droves, herded mercilessly into the ambushers' guns in order to give their masters the chance to stage a fighting retreat. Using the wreckage of the wretch for cover, Typhus' warriors dug in and kept firing. Other forces might have panicked or been overrun as the Shriven pressed home their attack, but the Death Guard are known for their tenacity above all things, and they displayed it now. Their faith was rewarded as a terrible droning buzz filled the air, and wreathed in the demonic insect swarms of the destroyer hive, Typhus led his surviving blight lords from the burning heart of the wreck. Scorched, wounded, but very much alive, the traveller rallied an armoured fist of demon engines about him before launching a spearhead assault that butchered more than 24 Tirata and stalled the Black Legion momentum. As the enemy pounded his warriors with harassing fire and probed for weaknesses, Typhus used the power of a slave sorcerer to contact his plague ship captains in orbit. What he learned gave the Death Guard fresh heart, successfully reforming their line. The plague ships, Filthmonger, Vermine Curse, and Leper's Blood had driven the Shriven cruisers back, mauling both the Hand of Darkness and the Bloodied Talon in the process. Tice's captains requested permission to press their attack and smash the smaller Shriven fleet, but the Traveller refused. Instead, he had the least damaged of his ships form a blockade to hold the Shriven craft at bay. Meanwhile, the Moribund and the Rancid Blade settled low in Limaxis' atmosphere and unleashed carefully targeted creeping bombardments. As lance beams and plague bombs streamed down from on high, the outermost Shriven support elements suddenly found themselves in the midst of a devastating firestorm. Herded inwards by the encircling fire patterns, Bile and his forces found themselves caught between ruinous detonations to their rear and the thunderous guns of the Death Guard to the fore. Worse was to follow as fresh waves of Death Guard made planetfall amid storms of fire to the north, southeast and southwest of the crash site. From their lowered ramps issued wave upon wave of plague-ridden poxwalkers. The grinning, groaning zombies spilled from their landing craft like vomit and encircled the Black Legion with the horrible inevitability of a wasting sickness. It appeared that the ambushers were now caught in their own barbed web. The Limaxis offensive had never been intended as a fight to the death, however, and Bile and Corian had their contingencies in place. Vox signals flashed northwards to where 3 of the Brazen Drake's renegade Thunderhawks and an ancient Emperor's Children Stormbird waited amidst the shadows of a rusting Imperial hangar. Not for nothing had Baal conditioned his slave clones to bring the wretch down where they had. Tangled screens of foliage burned away as the 4 heavy gunships burst from concealment with a scream of powerful engines. Blitzing the Death Guard's northernmost landing site as they went, the aircraft made for the looming hulk of a drowned hab block that had been designated as the Black Legion extraction site. Led by Corian and the last of Bile's first wave of Tirata, the Spider's surviving forces cut a bloody path through the groaning poxwalkers to reach the slumped habstack. Post-human warriors were dragged down and buried by mounds of grinning never-dead. Their armor peeled off them bit by bit, their eye lenses smashed out and questing fingers thrust into the gelid orbs beneath. Yet with Baal's augmented warriors rending, hacking and bludgeoning at the foe, and Corian's psychic blast reducing swathes of poxwalkers to ash, the Black Legion reached their objective. Baal himself led the push up the habstack's tilted, creeper-hung stairways and was the first to reach the lowered boarding ramp of his Stormbird. Death on Bearston. With the immediate threat staved off, the Shriven found themselves with a window of time in which to gather their strength and plan their next moves. However, cracks were already appearing in the alliance between Bile and the Enlightener. In the days following their triumphal return from Limaxis, the Shriven moved with even greater confidence. They had outmaneuvered and, to their minds, outfought Typhus himself. Having seen how ferociously the Tirata fought, they were able to gloss over the horrors of the warrior's demise, and Bile found himself with no shortage of willing test subjects for his surgeries. War bands of Shriven took to the warp aboard swift frigates, returning with more luckless raw materials for his elixirs and experiments. The Spider worked busily day and night. But Argento Corian was less than delighted with Baal's success. The Enlightener was sharply conscious that day by day his authority was being undermined. With Baal's compounds running through his veins, he could not bring himself to act against the parasite he had invited into his fortress. He could, however, remind his followers who their true master was. This he resolved to do. Auguries and demonic whispers revealed that the Imperial Retribution Force was now only a handful of short jumps away. Corian seers told him that his enemies had halted in the Bellis Corona system and were currently in orbit over the world of Bearston Prime. Corian announced that he would not cower and wait for his enemies to beard him in his lair. Instead, He mustered all but the most essential garrison forces and took ship at once for the Bellis Corona system. Baal accompanied him at the head of his latest batch of altered warriors, yet he had little interest in supporting what he saw as the Enlightener's posturing. Instead, Baal had his own agenda upon Bearston Prime. On hostile currents, Shield Captain Tyvar had led his torchbearers through the war-torn Nachmund gauntlet, through the fringes of war-torn Vigilus, and on into the very rim of the Eye of Terror. He and his comrades had remained strong, their purpose unwavering, but their road had been perilous indeed. Even with a full cadre of silent sisters scattered across their craft, each warp jump through the storms of the Imperium Nihilus had been hellish. They had faced hostile forces time and again. They had suffered losses. Now, with their quarry close at hand and the moment of truth almost upon them, Shield Captain Tyvar had elected to rearm and repair his surviving forces before running his prey to ground. Tyvar's hopes of refitting at the naval docks of Bellis Corona were dashed. That mighty fortress was beset by myriad foes, and what resources it had were required to keep its own fleets operational. Instead, Tyvar's task force settled into high orbit above Bearston Prime in hopes that the tech magi who ran its famed duralium mines could be prevailed upon to effect repairs. In fact, the torchbearers found a world abandoned and fallen into ruin. What catastrophe had overtaken Bearston Prime was unclear, but repeating warnings cycled across every Vox frequency, beseeching all to avoid this cursed world in the Omnissiah's name. Tyvar was in no mood to heed such ghostly deterrents, however, not when Auspex confirmed vast quantities of refined uranium languishing in rusted silos within a complex signified as Refinery 16. Leaving his own tech adepts to make what repairs they could upon his warships, the Shield Captain led his forces to the surface. They dove through its furious electric storms to claim the resources they required. Such was the Imperial disposition when the Enlightener and his fleet tore their way from the warp into Bellis Corona system. Swift and powerful though they were, the Imperial warships were in the midst of repairs. Heavy shuttles plied the void between the ships and the surface refinery. Presented with the sudden threat of an advancing Black Legion fleet, Shield Captain Tyvar's ships could do little more than fend off the heretic ships with battery fire, and do what they could to protect the vulnerable ore shuttles. The Enlightener had little interest in the Imperial ships, however. His quarry lay on the planet below, for he had sworn before all his warriors that he would slay Atal Tyvar in single combat. The enemy's fleet could be dealt with later, once the warriors they transported had been slain. On Corian's orders, flights of armoured gunships and combat landers flurried from the embarkation decks of his cruisers. Escorted by flights of Black Legion Helldrakes, they swept down upon Bearston's equatorial mining plains and isolated life signs around Refinery 16. The leading Shriven dropships were met by ferocious anti-aircraft fire. Tyvar had woken the servitor crews of the refinery's Icarus turrets. Now the weapons tracked and span, barrels thumping as they fired clouds of flak shells up at the descending craft. Helldrakes pinwheeled away, trading frames of wing fragments. A heavy lander detonated, raining wreckage and blazing bodies down upon the refinery. It was Baal who gave the order for the Shriven to redirect their assault, sending their dropships swooping away towards the small industrial spaceport a mile to the south. Solid utilitarian assemblages of landing pads and outbuildings, all connected to the refinery by mag rails set atop high, rocky causeways. Shield Captain Tyvar had set squads of custodians to defend each of them. As the Shriven craft swept down one after another upon the southern port, however, it rapidly became clear that the odds were impossible, even for warriors of the Adeptus Custodes. Shrugging off hammering volleys of fire from the dropships, the custodians fell back with their guardians' spears blazing and fled along the causeway. Corian and his Shriven were right on their heels. Baal, for his part, hung back, marshalling a sizable force of Terrata before following more cautiously in the Enlightener's wake. His approach proved prudent, as halfway through the causeway a band of Virtus Praetors struck. They had streaked in low, using the rocky bulk of the causeway to mask their approach. Now they reared suddenly into view amidst a howl of powerful engines and subjected the Shriven to a punishing salvo of missiles. As they did, the retreating Custodes turned and let fly. Explosions tore Heretic Astartes apart. A shriven predator detonated with a fiery roar, chunks of its wreckage spinning away ablaze. The Enlightener's furious oaths echoed across the lightning-lashed plains. The air quivered with empiric tension before the altered sorcerer unleashed a furious storm of psychic energies into the causeway. Even the vaunted Aegis of the Emperor was not enough to stop this explosion of raw force, which hurled 3 of the custodians from the causeway and sent 2 Dawn Eagle jet bikes spinning away to explode on the hard bedrock below. Again the surviving Imperial forces fell back, and again the Shriven gave chase. Again, Bile hung back amidst the bulk of the assault force, watching with detached interest as Corian and his chosen warriors reached their railhead in the shadows of the refinery's towers. Here the Imperial forces struck back, bolters and flamers roaring as squads of Null Maidens sprung an ambush of their own. Even Bile recoiled at the Null aura that the Silent Sisters projected, while Corian, front and center in the renegade battle lines, howled in agony at the sudden stifling of his empiric senses. The attack might have faltered there and then, but Bile hissed orders of his own. Altered warriors and flesh-twisted bikers bullied their way to the fore, with Bile in their midst, and hurled themselves at the outnumbered foe. At the same time, the surviving Helldrake swept back in, the draconic shadows crisscrossing the engagement area as warp flames belched from their maws. Once more the Imperial forces fell back in good order, leaving their fallen blazing or bolter-riddled in their wake. This time the Enlightener halted. He had successfully claimed a beachhead upon the rocky plateau that housed the refinery proper, but only thanks to Bile's quick thinking. Conscious that his control was slipping, and perhaps his sanity with it, the Enlightener fought to think clearly and strategize. Snapping out orders, he broke his surviving warriors into several smaller warbands, each supported by obliterators and demon engines, each led in by squads of Rhino APCs who could watch for further traps as the Shriven pushed forward. Auspex showed the majority of the foe gathered around the macro silos at the refinery's heart, and so the Shriven pushed their way through the tangle of rusted machinery, creaking cranes and abandoned structures. Bile, however, split his small force off from the main advance. Corian was only too happy to see him go, ordering only that Bile should stay out of his way. The Spider, for his part, was also pleased, for here was a rare chance to harvest fine specimens for his work, for his great work. He vanished into the gloomy alleys between the refinery's towering buildings, taking with him several squads of his most heavily altered followers, as well as a gaggle of gibbering acolytes clad in rubberized surgical gear. Again the Imperial forces struck at the Shriven, and again. Now, though, the Heretic Astartes met them with disciplined fire and vicious counter-assaults that saw even the Attemptus Custodes driven back. At first, Corian led the way into the refinery's central processing yard amidst blizzards of psychic fire. There the Shriven met the main strength of the Imperial force, and had their master been in his right mind, they might have rethought their assault. Shield Captain Tyvar had gathered a formidable force of custodians and Null Maidens around him. Venerable Contemptor Dreadnoughts and even Land Raiders rumbled in support. Yet Bile's twisted surgery had done terrible things to the Enlightener, and to many of his followers. Unable to restrain their psychotic battle lust, they hurled themselves into a maniacal charge, and battle was joined. As the fighting raged, none noticed the dark figure that crouched amidst the rustling walkways of a micro-silo high above. The figure stayed still as death, a long and deadly-looking rifle cradled in its hands. Bile heard it all from a distance, the muffled thunder of gunfire, and the clash of blades echoing to where he and his warriors stalked in the shadows. They had circumnavigated the refinery until they reached a separate causeway that connected to another of the complex's spaceports. As Bile had hoped, a single custodian warden with an understrength squad of Null Maidens lingered here. They were clearly dying to join the battle, but duty compelled them to watch over the continued efforts of heavy servitors, still ferrying shipments of duralium into waiting mag cartridges, and thence to the shuttles docked at the spaceport below. Only too glad to offer his enemies a taste of the fighting they had been denied, Bile loosed his terrata on them. Altered warriors surged forward with lunatic howls, shrugging off direct hits from bolt rounds and the slashing kiss of powered blades. Deformed limbs and heads spun away as the Imperial warriors hacked and hewed furiously. Yet Baal's warriors were relentless. They felt neither pain nor fear, bloodshot eyes bulging and foul appendages thrashing as they surrounded their victims and sought not to kill them, but to wound, weaken, and finally grapple them to the ground. As the fight turned his way, Baal strode forward, the rod of torment tapping with every pace. With surgical precision, the spider shot each of his victims in turn, aiming for exposed armor joints and bared flesh. His Xylos needler hissed like a serpent as it spat one dart after another, each loaded with tremendously powerful paralyzing toxins of Baal's own manufacture. As each victim fell, Baal's twisted acolytes descended on them and dragged them away into the shadows. Only now that he had his harvest did the spider turn and lead the last of his altered warriors back to Corian's aid. He arrived in time to see the shriven hard-pressed and teetering upon the brink of collapse. The Enlightener himself, however, was hanging suspended in a corona of witchfire, eyes blazing and hands outstretched as he drove Shield Captain Tyvar to his knees. It was then that the echoing crack of a high-powered sniper rifle cut the din of battle. Corian jerked in mid-air. Blood puffed from the side of his skull. His fires blinked out in a heartbeat, and his body crashed heavily to the ground. The battle ended in that moment. In the rout that followed, only the martial might of the Shriven allowed them to execute a fighting retreat to their dropcraft. Amidst the mayhem and bloodshed, Baal's Terrata bore the twitching body of Argento Corian from the field. Baal led them, gunning down the few loyalists who barred his path, smiling all the while. The unravelling web. Baal and the surviving Shriven retreated to Dasar, falling back to their fortress's high battlements and gun emplacements. With the Enlightener apparently slain, his former followers looked to Baal for leadership. They were his creatures now, just as he had planned all along, yet peril drew closer by the day. The Shriven seers wailed of not one but two foes drawing closer with every passing hour. In desperation, some amongst the warband besieged Fabius Baal to aid them, while others muttered darkly that the spider had already done more than enough. For his part, Baal was satisfied with events. He had not predicted Corian's fall upon Bearston, and had some grey suspicions about its authors, but he had been quick to capitalize upon this unexpected boon. Baal had made great strides behind the sealed doors of his laboratory. Now he sought to make good his escape. Baal gathered the Shriven within the Enlightener's grand throne room and addressed them. He spoke of his desire to see these invaders crushed, both the filth-ridden Death Guard and the presumptuous corpse worshippers. He could do it, he said, but not without the complete loyalty of the remaining Shriven. This was at last too much for Argento Corian's surviving chosen. Tempers flared as they accused the rest of the warband of being duped. They called Baal an opportunistic ghoul, cursed the day he had come to Desar, and laid the Enlightener's death firmly at Baal's feet. At this, the spider merely smiled, and signalled his surgeon acolytes to unveil his last masterpiece. Argento Corian was much changed. The parts of his brain not destroyed by the round passing through his skull had been scooped out by Baal's chirurgeons. The altered golem that stalked into the throne room was the Enlightener in name only. Bulging red eyes stared from a face riven with stitch marks, scarified runes and wires. His armor strained to contain his muscle-bulked physique. Pipes and tubes gurgled with weird fluids, flushing through Corian's armor and body alike. Unbridled psychic potential crackled around the Enlightener, though with his skull emptied of its contents, all but Fabius Baal wondered how such a thing could be done. How such a thing could be. Incensed, those loyal to Corian's former incarnation went for their blades. The Enlightener annihilated them with beams of psychic fire. Baal asked again for the loyalty of the Shriven, and this time, standing over the blackened and mangled remains of their former comrades, they agreed to a man. Baal planned to augment every remaining Shriven Chaos Space Marine. He ordered all defenders concentrated within Desar's primary bastion, which was partially built into a towering mountain. He commanded that the outer defences be demolished and laced with booby traps, ensuring his enemies would have to come at him through a lethal killing zone. When the foe attacked, the Enlightener and the Shriven were to stand firm in the fortress's defence, drawing the foe in and pinning them before the walls. Only then would Baal unleash his masterstroke. A flight of modified Helldrakes would belch neurotoxin fumes over the battle. Baal assured his followers this would leave them untouched while driving the Death Guard and Imperial warriors into a murderous frenzy. With their enemies lost to madness and tearing one another apart, Baal and the remaining Shriven could flee aboard a swift frigate and slip away into the warp. Frenzied preparations followed Baal's pronouncements, and the primary bastion was ready by the time Typhus's plague ships appeared about Dessar. The traveller had not been idle. Piratical raids of neighbouring systems had yielded the resources to repair his vessels. He had gathered cultists from several different worlds, and swollen his depleted ranks further by the addition of thousands upon thousands of poxwalkers. Now he was coming for the Ark Cornu Contagious, and for revenge. The surviving Shriven warships attempted to use Baal's night shields to ambush the Death Guard again. This time Typhus was ready. He had spread tracker entities across his fleet and given each of them the warp scent of the Shriven. Thus, even as the Black Legion cruisers pounced, they found gun batteries primed and pointed right at them. Explosive carnage filled Dessar's orbital envelope. Wreckage rained down as flaming meteorites through the planet's atmosphere. When the battle barge, Drake Rampant, attempted a desperate and horribly misjudged boarding assault against the Terminus Est, the battle swung in Typhus's favour. Soon enough, the rusting, plague-riddled hulk of the Drake Rampant was tumbling away, while Death Guard landers swept down upon the primary bastion. Death Guard forces landed in great number amidst the fortress's outer defences. Booby traps detonated as shambling swarms of poxwalkers triggered them. So numerous were the Never-Dead that the fiery blasts made barely a dent. Behind them came bands of Plague Marines escorting batteries of Plague Burst Crawlers. The demonic artillery spoke again and again, lofting hails of blight-laden shells through the air to slam against the fortress's walls. Soon enough, they had blasted a wide and rotting breach. Trudging masses of infantry made for the yawning rent in the fortress's walls, but here the Enlightener and his Shriven counterattacked furiously. Blasts of psychic force ploughed through the poxwalkers and hurled their broken corpses left and right. Altered warriors tore their shambling foes apart, slaughtering swathes of them for every Terrata that was dragged down and torn to bits. Yet all was but a distraction. Even as the fighting raged down below, unclean energies flashed and crackled within the fortress. Typhus and his Terminator retinue stepped from them with grim resolve. They had come for the Ark, and for Baal's head, and the sorcerous auspexes within their corrupt helms told them that both were nearby. Baal was alerted to his peril by the thunder of servitor guns and the howling of demonic guardian entities. He had laboured at his great works up to the last moment, but now he was concerned that his obsessive desire to keep experimenting might have led him to linger too long. Surgeon acolytes began stowing his samples and wheeling biosarcophagi into anti-grav transit racks, but Baal knew that if Typhus was not slowed, then they would never escape. Regretfully, the Spider activated his latest batch of altered warriors, the very finest of his creations from Dessar. Raving and frothing, the twisted monsters burst from the lab and surged into battle. It was now, as the battle raged, that Tyvar and his torchbearers arrived over Dessar. Acting swiftly, the Shield Captain gathered what auspex and picked data he could, formulated a robust plan, then led his forces down through the planet's atmosphere aboard armoured gunships. The craft streaked in low, hugging Dessar's rocky terrain to avoid detection. As the furious battle spread out before them, the bulk of the Imperial forces peeled off and made for the Death Guard's rear lines. The gilded gunships delivered Adeptus Custodes and Silent Sisters into the ruins, where they struck at the demon engines still pummeling the fortress. Fighting raged through the ruins as custodians hacked apart mephitic blight haulers, and salvos of blight shells laid gleaming Imperial heroes low, and one by one, the plague burst crawlers were blasted to scrap. With the enemy guns silenced, the Adeptus Custodes and Null Maidens turned for the breach. Their orders were to hack a path through the besieging hordes to where the Enlightener still fought and, now that the threat of plague bombardment had been removed, engaged the turncoat sorcerer. Meanwhile, a pair of Imperial gunships drew level with one of the primary bastion's upper casemates. They blasted a ragged hole in the structure, then lowered their ramps and disgorged Shield Captain Tyvar and 2 full squads of Alaras custodians into the fortress's halls. Tyvar's warriors had made positive identification of Fabius Bile during the fighting on Bearston Prime, and Tyvar knew that he had to try to slay the loathed heretic. Moreover, several of Tyvar's warriors had gone missing during that fight, and he had little doubt that Bile was to blame. As he led his warriors through the fortress's corridors towards the sound of battle, the Shield Captain hoped he could rescue those comrades from Bile's twisted ministrations. Minutes later, Fabius Bile emerged from his laboratory and straight into the midst of a gun battle. Typhus and his surviving Terminators were trading furious volleys of fire with the advancing Shield Captain and his Alaras custodians, their conflict blocking Bile's route to freedom. With a snarl, the primogenitor launched himself into the fight even as Typhus bellowed in recognition. Bile raised his Zyklos Needler, raining toxic rounds upon his enemies and sending a Blight Lord Terminator crashing to the ground. Several of Bile's surgeon acolytes were gunned down as they frantically shoved their grav reliquaries through the vicious crossfire, and even Bile himself grunted with pain as he was shot several times, his chirurgeon clicking madly as it sought to seal his wounds. Seeing his quarry about to escape, Typhus launched a headlong charge with his Man Reaper swinging. Before the weapon could connect, Bile and the last of his underlings vanished through another armoured bulkhead that sealed behind him with a hiss and a clang. The next moment, Typhus found himself faced with the vengeful Shield Captain and his Alaras custodians. A glance at the ragged remains of his retinue told Typhus that this was a fight he could not win. Spitting a vow to have his vengeance upon Bile, he chanted an incantation and was wreathed in a roaring swarm of plague flies. When they dissipated, the traveller was gone, leaving the last of his warriors to face the fury of Tyvar and his companions alone. At the breach, the Enlightener and his berserk warriors had torn and blasted so many foes that mountains of dead lay around them. Yet their numbers too were dwindling. It was now that the execution force struck. First came a rifle round, fired from atop a ruined spire. The Enlightener's head snapped up, and he obliterated the bullet in mid-air with a psychic blast. The Empiric bolt roared on, back up the shot's trajectory to impact with killing force. Amidst the explosion, a ruined, black-clad figure tumbled blazing to its death. Next came the Calidus, morphing into true form as she suddenly emerged from amidst the Enlightener's shocked cultists. Her neural shredder howled as she blasted first one shriven Tirata, then another and another. Flipping over a fourth, the Calidus swept her phase sword around to decapitate the altered warrior, then drove the blade into the Enlightener's chest. The sorcerer roared with pain, then blasted the lithe assassin backwards in a mound of corpses with another psychic pulse. Yet his bellow of triumph became a howl of agony as a beam of raw darkness hit him, banishing his psychic powers in an instant. The Enlightener looked up to see the eerie figure of a Limaxis assassin flickering towards him. Before the sorcerer could regain his powers, the skull-masked figure of an Eversaur assassin tore through a knot of Tirata like an artillery shell and ploughed into him. The frenzied assassin tore madly at the Enlightener. One hand was blown off by a bolt round from the Eversaur's executioner pistol before the assassin's hypodermic talons sunk deep into the Enlightener's face. One eye punctured, flesh blackening with toxins, the altered sorcerer grabbed his assailant by the throat, lifting him high and snapping the assassin's neck with raw psychokinetic force. The Enlightener enjoyed a moment of triumph before the Eversaur's blood chemistry went into critical meltdown, and his body exploded with the force of a demolition charge. As the dust settled, the ruptured corpse of the Enlightener finally twitched its last. Their mission completed, the Calexus and wounded Calidus vanished into the anarchy of the battle. Yet in truth, the conflict was done. A few tattered handfuls of Shriven remained, leaderless, lost to madness or fleeing wildly. As a warband, they were utterly spent. Word had reached the Death Guard, meanwhile, that their master had returned to the Plague Fleet and had ordered them to fall back. Their quarry had escaped again. Full of bitterness and disgust, the Plague Marines quit the field. Less than a quarter of Shield Captain Tyvar's original forces remained to link up deep within the fortress and purge the revolting horrors remaining within Bile's abandoned laboratory. With their target slain, but their comrades lost to Baal's clutches, Tyvar believed it essential that word of what they had witnessed should find its way back to the Imperial authorities. This would be his new duty. Thus the Imperial warriors collected their fallen, lamented their loss, and left the Cadian gate behind them. As for Fabius Baal, he was not seen again upon Dasar. His ship had slipped away, a light frigate ghosting through the orbital debris fields and the last flickering exchanges of the Void Warp before punching into warp space and making good its escape. The Primogenitor had work to do upon Urum, and he did not mean for it to be delayed.